Hello fellow sim racers. Today marks the release of the 2020 GT World Challenge DLC for Assetto Corsa Competizione. What that means is countless physics updates in version 1.6 of the title and new content in the form of Imola and the 2020 versions of the AMG GT3 and the Ferrari 488. Since there's loads to cover in this video, I'm just going to jump straight into the juicy bits, starting with Imola. Arguably, Imola is the big ticket item in the 2020 GT World Challenge DLC. The real-world venue is legendary and holds a significant place in motorsport history, both good and bad. So, unsurprisingly, it's a bit of a staple choice in many racing sims. But on a personal level, I've never really gelled with it as a sim racer. Part of the issue is that it's a circuit that requires serious commitment, and for one reason or another, I've never felt the confidence with Imola in various racing sims to have that level of feel, or indeed belief in the car to truly attack the circuit the way I feel it should be. But that's no issue here, and I can honestly say that this is the first version of Imola that I've truly enjoyed driving. On the previous Kunos version of the circuit in Assetto Corsa, I always felt like I needed to baby the car, being super careful with curbs and taking a more cautious approach with track limits than I'd like. But here, on the 2020 version, I feel like you can, for want of better phrasing, thrash the living daylights out of the circuit, and that makes it just so much more attractive as a proposition. The new circuit features a contemporary laser scan with all of the changes that were made for the 2020 GT World Challenge event, and featured in the rather delicious F1 event that was held there a few short weeks ago. The curbs are a big part of what's different to the older version, but in terms of how this differs from classic Assetto Corsa, the influence of the multi-point tyre collision model obviously has a big influence as well. Regardless of the reasoning, it feels fantastic to push a car to the limits here. As you would expect, the circuit looks fantastic in-game, and it's very much up to the standard that we would all expect from the other circuits in ACC. And the attention to detail on track is just as good as it is off track. I particularly enjoyed the socially distanced crowd, complete with masks, which definitely helps this circuit in a part of our collective motorsport history which one would hope won't be repeated. These contextual details likely won't be noticed by the vast majority of users, but for saddos like me that get more than our fair share of use out of the free camera, they are very much welcomed. Unlike the AMG GT3, there really aren't many external visual cues to tell the 2020 488 GT3 apart from its predecessor. With the GT3 version already firmly wedged against the boundaries of the FIA-mandated performance window, the GT track car development team deemed that there was very little to be gained from reinventing the wheel, at least on the outside that is. The one thing that will jump out are these rather severe winglets behind the front wheel arches. These are visual cues to a much larger change to the front aero philosophy, designed to extract air from the front splitter more consistently and to provide a more predictable airflow along the rest of the car. These changes and the addition of new front dive planes are really designed to provide an aero package that can be trimmed closer to the limits of the performance window and critically to allow a larger setup window for the car, especially in terms of ride height. Alongside the usual quality of life improvements that generally come part and parcel of these Evo cars are significant improvements to the electronics, ABS and traction control systems in particular, which were no slouch in the old car, it has to be said. The ABS system on the real car now measures lateral forces, bringing it in line with something ACC was already doing, while the traction control system from the GTE version of the car has also been implemented, which is, to cut a very long story short, much more responsive. Now, into SimWorld, and like the AMG, the differences they're not night and day from the previous car. However, unlike the German car, the differences in driving feel are much more pronounced, or at least they are to me. The front end of the new car does feel more precise, providing a more responsive overall balance, though of course this is with the caveat of any perceived setup differences between the two. The improvements to the traction control system have also been implemented, along with various engine map changes. This provides, in my experience at least, a wider operating range of settings. Essentially, there seems to be less penalty for using higher traction control and engine map settings thanks to that reduced response time. This pairs rather well with real life, where drivers use these systems to help trim the car and adapt to different track conditions, rather than just setting them to the most aggressive setting possible, which is possibly the more common sim racing approach. On top of that, we have the much hinted at but not yet explained until later in the video, tyre construction changes to take into account as well. So, with so many variables at play and only a couple of days to make this video, I'll leave it simply with this. The new Ferrari feels sharper than the old one, both in terms of responsiveness to direction change and in terms of pickup as well. The 2020 AMG GT3 is an interesting beast. Like most GT3 update program cars, you'll find that there are more similarities with the predecessor than there are differences. But in this case, the differences really are quite subtle, excepting of course for the front grille, which is anything but. So, the new car has the same downforce levels, which were right on the limits of what the FIA would allow anyway. It's got an almost identical chassis, and the power plant is still that much loved 6.3 litre naturally aspirated V8. In fact, many of the changes are firmly aimed at improving reliability, cooling and stiffening chassis mount points, and of course quality of life improvements for mechanics. So far, so uninteresting, at least from a sim racing perspective. But what does move the needle in the sim world is the improved drag and, crucially, the impact of the 2020 tyres, which we'll talk about in detail later on in the video. Unlike the Ferrari, this is a subtle update, again excepting for the front grille. And as such, Mercedes have sold a significant number of these in the form of an upgrade kit, yours for a mere €45,000 rather than a complete new chassis. Now, back in SimWorld, sitting in the 2020 AMG GT3 for the first time puts you firmly in Uncanny Valley territory. Everything is incredibly familiar, but a few of the details are just slightly off. Perhaps it's just the sleep-deprived brain of a newish father, but for the first few minutes everything just looked a bit odd to me. That went away, of course, and as you would expect, it is just as detailed and well executed on the inside as the 2016 model. Consistency is king. But that whole feeling of familiar but not quite the same thing repeats itself when you pull out of the pits for the first time. The engine note sounds right, the sightlines are the same, but once you start to lean on the car, it's, well, not quite what you'd expect. That heavy front end feel and the lively rear are still there, but arguably the latter's a little bit more pronounced on the throttle now. And that's when it hits you that the 2020 tyres and their stiffer sidewalls have a pretty significant impact. Really, it's the small nuances that make the driving experience different from the 2016 model. And of course, once you settle into a rhythm, it all starts to feel very intuitive and, dare I say it, a more entertaining driving experience than the old car. The updates for the overall tyre model and the tyres for the 2020 season are arguably less interesting than the headline-grabbing content, but they're easily the most important part of this update. Aris has provided some excellent in-depth details about the changes, and I'll do my best to communicate them here as simply and clearly as possible. The updates broadly fall into two categories. First, modifications to the overall tyre model, which will impact all of the cars and the seasons. And second, the new 2020 DHE tyres. This second category reflects changes in the construction of the Pirelli tyres introduced for the 2020 GT World Challenge Europe season. This impacts the 2020 season selections in single player and the European circuits with the 2020 tag in multiplayer. So that's 2020 versions of Monza, Brands Hatch, Silverstone, Paul Ricard, Misano, Zandvoort, Spa, Nürburgring, Hungaroring, Barcelona, Imola and Zolder. Overall changes to the tyre model, which will impact all of the cars and all of the seasons, are largely centred around tyre realignment forces. And this is very noticeable at and slightly over the grip limit. Better data has allowed Kunos to develop a model that provides more consistency in these situations, which are critically felt when driving very much on the edge and in states where the tyre is in more of a transitional state. What this means in practice is more predictable behaviour during fast direction changes, fewer issues in light load situations, over crests, and it also lessens the ingress of lift-off oversteer when coming off of the brakes. In short, the tyres feel more responsive around the grip limit. This is immediately obvious in the driving seat once you push just a little bit too hard. In my opinion, ACC has always been one of the better sims when it comes to recovering a car to a sensible slip angle caused by a little bit of over-enthusiasm. But there was always a limit at which the car would start to wash away and it would take a long time for the tyres to regain grip again, even at low speed. I'm reticent to say that this behaviour is completely eliminated because I've only had a few days of testing, but if it is still there, it's dramatically reduced. Overall, you can, should you choose to, drive with more extreme slip angles, or to put it another way, drift. Obviously this is both slow and horrible for your tyres, but it's a good way to demonstrate the more predictable feel over the grip limit. Where this is most noticeable from my testing is in some of the more twitchy mid-engine cars. Aris was keen to suggest that we drove the previously tricky Lambo to feel the difference, and well, I suggest you do the same. As an aside, when I'm talking about feel, I'm not just referencing the visual and audible cues from the sim, but specifically from the force feedback, which has much more usable information in those situations that we've just discussed than it did in the past. As far as I'm concerned, and this is only my opinion, this is a notable improvement on the tyre model in use in version 1.59. The final change to note is a more accurate simulation of the knock-on effects of tyre pressures, where grip drop-off is a little bit more pronounced when the tyre is over or under pressured. Furthermore, the relationship between pressure and rolling resistance has been altered to provide a more realistic, non-linear relationship, which should help out in some of those weird edge case situations which can and often are open to exploitation. Now, I've not yet had enough track time to really verify any of that since it's, well, a pretty subtle change, but perhaps the best route here is to go and ask some of the more competition-focused racers who might have more insight. Or in other words, go ask Niels. The other big story regarding tyres is the new for 2020 construction from Pirelli. According to their marketing, the tyre is designed to provide better support, especially under high aero load situations, better heating, more traction at the rear, and, critically, more consistent grip levels throughout the 60-minute stint. Again, this is an area that needs a decent amount of testing, so nuances are perhaps yet to show themselves. However, the tyre degradation factor is immediately noticeable. The DHD2 tyres, which were used throughout 2018 and 2019, had a prominent peak performance window at the beginning of the tyre's life, and this was reflected well in ACC. The 2020 tyre, however, has significantly less drop-off, and that noticeable fresh tyre bump that you used to get is much less of a factor. This will certainly have an impact on sprint racing, allowing drivers to push harder towards the end of races, and the impact on endurance racing strategy should be fairly self-explanatory. As with any major update, there are a raft of small tweaks, most of which aren't interesting enough to mention here, but there are a couple that I'd like to highlight. First of all, the logic for the delta timer has been upgraded, and honestly it feels more reliable and less, for want of a better word, bouncy in the data that it displays. On top of that are the tweaks to the AI system that we've been seeing going on in the background for a little while. Sadly, the final build of this wasn't available for me to test out properly, so I can't really comment on how that's going. Moving on, and I'm very aware that this video has been going on a while and it's gotten quite technical, but there's one more big physics change that I should cover here before I bring things to a close. ACC version 1.6 brings improvements in the behaviour of aerodynamic elements in your situations. Honestly, it's more exciting than it sounds. Assetto Corsa Competizione has always modelled the effect of yaw on aerodynamic elements, such as wing splitters and diffusers, but now the simulation is more nuanced. To try and put this simply, as an aerodynamic element experiences a change in yaw, or side-to-side movement in layman's terms, the efficiency of that element changes. A well-designed element will lose very little efficiency when experiencing a small amount of yaw, but as the yaw angle increases, the efficiency decreases up to the point where the element completely stalls, causing a significant loss of downforce. Now, if I've understood Aris correctly, the changes that they've implemented mean a less linear, and ultimately more complicated, relationship between yaw angle and efficiency. What this means in practice is improved control over slides at low speeds, where the loss in aero efficiency has less of an impact. Conversely, it does also mean that there's a more pronounced aero drop-off when the car is sliding at high speeds. In short, if you slide the car at high speed, stalling an aerodynamic element is going to be more, memorable. Version 1.6 of Assetto Corsa Competizione brings some nice refinements in the physics department, and especially regarding the tyre model, which I think most of us will be more than happy with. As for the DLC, it's great to have the 2020 GT World Challenge season represented in the sim, even if that's limited to a couple of new cars in Imola, and of course a load of new liveries as well. Some of you may have noticed that Manu Core isn't included in the DLC pack, and unfortunately that's a consequence of the reality that we found ourselves in 2020. Imola is very local to Kunos, whereas the middle of France isn't so much. While this is a bit of a shame, it is of course a reflection of the situation within which we all find ourselves right now. Moving on, and as is usually the case, Kunos haven't published details of the DLC pack pricing yet, though I should note that historically speaking, the DLC is very competitively priced compared to their competitors. Though of course, if things have changed and I'm now incorrect, please feel free to test out how well YouTube filters pick up on Italian swear words in the comments. All in, I personally think that the inclusion of Imola is good enough reason to justify the new content, and that's before we mention the 2 Evo cars and dozens of new liveries. Of course, your mileage may vary. So that just about brings things to a close here. The 2020 GT World Challenge DLC should be live on Steam now, with the console version arriving later on in the winter. If you've enjoyed the video, it would be great if you could hit the like button and subscribe so you can see more content like this in the future. So all that's left to say is goodbye, thank you for watching, and enjoy the rest of your day.